I'd just like to start by thanking you all so much for coming. It's a really exciting event, and it's just great that there's so many of you here. I'd also like to thank Jean for letting us use this opportunity to really celebrate what you've done. It's really important, and we're very excited to be able to do so. Okay, so before I start, there's just some, yes, so who am I? I'm Dan Lawson. I'm just a guy on a podium shouting at you. So I'm the director of the Jean Golding Institute for Data Science and Data Intensive Research, named after, of course, Jean. And before I get to that, I've just got some kind of housekeeping. So there's no fire drill planned. So if the fire alarms go, we're all to leave the building through the emergency exits, and we're to head out to the big beetle statue. And that's the assembly point. And beyond that, I think it's going to be the next slide. Yes, there it is. So there we go. Toilets, both sides. So, the majority of them are that way. First aid, let one of the We the Curious staff know, or the organizers. So the organizers have purple names, speakers green, and everybody else is on different color, red. And finally, if you don't want to be included in any of the photographs that are being taken at this event, that's no problem at all. Just let the photographer know, and he'll make sure that you're not. Because we've got a busy schedule, we're going to keep questions for the networking lunch at the end. Okay, so, right, so to get us into the right frame of mind, I'd just like to start by, well, inviting you all to play a bit of a game, and it's a game of counterfactuals. So it's a game of what would have happened if Jean had not made the ALSPAC study happen when she did, and with the clarity of vision that she made it happen with. So one of the first things that would happen is, of course, our institute would have a different name. But beyond that, of course, the tens of thousands of participants, they would not have been in that study. They would have not been engaged with science. They would not have been asked to reflect on their life and filled in those questionnaires. I'd like to think that that is not a zero intervention that's been taken place there. The second, of course, is the impact on science. So science is self-correcting. So eventually we will find out the true things. But unlike in a kind of standard research project where we might be beating the other team by six months to publication, a longitudinal study like this, it takes many, many years to bear fruit. And the value of all of these longitudinal studies adds to each other. So they're all more informative about science because we have many of them. So it's going to be huge, that impact. Of course, staff and students, they've worked on this project. We have jobs, we have data to work on. And so there's direct benefits, but also indirect ones, right? So hundreds, thousands of people have gotten to do things they otherwise wouldn't. I myself got to work as an undergraduate coding questionnaires, paper ones, and besides giving me an opportunity to not flip burgers that summer, it was also a real inspiration to make sure that my future was digital. And the final thing is the impact on the University of Bristol. So we've, of course, had this as an institution inside the medical school, and lots of impacts of that. One of which would be bringing together an excuse for people to work on causal inference to analyze these data. So, the causal impact of Jean's work led to people in this room today working on causal impact. Now, I'm not saying that somebody should do the study of what is the causal impact of genes work in that way, but well, as the children of the 90s would say, ... Great. So I'm now going to turn over the floor to our Vice Chancellor, Evelyn Welch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan, and good morning, everyone. And it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this special celebration. I won't start by a rousing happy birthday, but I hope there will be some singing later on. Because we are come together today to celebrate the remarkable work of Professor Jean Goulding and the far-reaching legacy, as you've heard, of her work. And today we not only reflect on her many extraordinary achievements, but also honor the profound and ongoing impact her work continues to have on the fields of science and public health in Bristol and beyond. I am Jean's, we just worked it out, 5th Vice Chancellor. It means that not only does she understand data and public health, she also understands how important it is to get into my office early. And she was one of the very first of my visitors, ensuring that I understood in depth and in detail the importance of long-term thinking. The importance not just of the samples and the cohort, but of the support, institutional wraparound support that is needed to do something that takes time. And she also pointed out that she couldn't get up the stairs to her institute because we'd placed it in an 18th century building with no lift. So she managed to remind me that I carry many legacies and I carry the decisions that my predecessors have made before me, and that I am responsible for ensuring the success going forward, not just a decade, not just 20 years, but literally 50, 100, 150 years in the future. I'm a historian, so that long-term thinking really resonates with me. Now, Professor Goulding's career has been nothing short of extraordinary, and I won't attempt to enumerate all her incredible accomplishments. We'd be here far longer than my allocated time, and many of these will be highlighted throughout the day. But you are all here in part because she's best known as the visionary behind the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, otherwise known as the not wonderful acronym ALSPAC. I prefer Children of the 90s. It's got a better ring to it. This groundbreaking study revolutionized our understanding of how factors shape human health across the lifespan by tracking the health and development of thousands of children from birth to adulthood. The data generated by ALSPAC has been a cornerstone for research, not just in Bristol, but worldwide, leading to the publication of nearly 3,000 research papers by scientists across the globe. And this treasure trove of information has informed countless studies and public health policies, pushing the boundaries of what we know and what we can achieve. Now, this means, of course, that the impact of genes policies pushing those boundaries extend far beyond academia, shaping public health guidelines, improving maternal and child health, addressing childhood obesity, and informing strategies, prevention and treatment of mental health conditions. And this is only just a small list. It's a legacy of real-world change, where science not only seeks to understand, but also to improve lives in the here and now. And of course, one of the most enduring aspects of Professor Goulding's legacy is her pioneering new research methodologies. Through ALSPAC, she demonstrated the power of research that doesn't just capture a single moment in time, but follows individuals over many years, revealing the complexities of their lives and the factors, many factors influencing their health. And this approach has paved the way for cutting-edge transgenerational research. She told me when she came to visit me, she was going back to the grandparents now. allowing us to explore how the experiences and exposures of one generation can affect the health of the next. And we'll hear more on this topic during the keynote by Professor Louise Kenny later this morning. Professor Golding's influence also extends into the field of data science, having used data in innovative ways to uncover patterns, predict outcomes, and improve public health. And in recognition of this contribution, the University of Bristol honoured her by naming the Jean Golding Institute for Data Science and Data Intensive Research. And this institute, despite its unpromising location, stands as a testament to her pioneering spirit and her commitment to harnessing the power of data to solve real-world problems. But of course, her contributions go far beyond data and discoveries. As a staunch advocate for ethical research practices, she ensured that the families involved in her studies were not merely subjects, but partners in the research. And it's really fitting that today's event is held here at We the Curious, home to the Open City Research Lab, which embodies the same ethos in its work. Jean recognized the importance of building trust, respecting the dignity of participants, and communicating findings in a way that can be understood and used by those outside the scientific community. And her commitment to these principles has set a gold standard in the field, ensuring that the benefits of research are shared with those who contribute to it. So as we celebrate Professor Golding's legacy today, I promise that we will continue to uphold these ethical standards in our work. That is a collective promise and an individual promise. We all have a responsibility to carry forward the principles of integrity, rigor, and social responsibility that have characterized Jean's career. This event is not just a reflection on the past, but a call to action for the future. A future in which we continue to build on Jean's remarkable work, ask new questions, and strive for discoveries that will benefit generations to come. And throughout the morning, we will hear from discipline-leading speakers who will share insights and reflect on the power of curiosity and consider how we can continue to push the boundaries of knowledge together. And I look forward to seeing her in my office again as she tries to make sure that we follow through on these promises. Thank you, Jean. Thank you personally. Thank you all for being here today to honor Professor Jean Golding. Let's make the most of the next few hours as we celebrate Jean's extraordinary legacy and look forward together to the inspiration that it has created for us. Thank you, Jean Golding.
So our keynote speaker for today is Louise Kenny, and her list of accomplishments are no less long. She is the Executive Pro-Vice Chancellor for Liverpool University. She is CBE, which I looked up as Commander of the British Order. My favorite fact was that she was Woman in the Year in STEM by the Irish Tatler. And going back to the causal impact question, you know, which of those two has the biggest impact on women in STEM? So I'd like to welcome you to the stage. Please welcome Louise. I'm a bit uncertain. There we go.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Dan, for that very generous introduction. I don't know the answer to the question. I suspect it's probably the Tatler magazine, but to be further investigated. I'd like to start by thanking Nick and the organising committee for the generous invitation to speak today. When Nick asked me, I just thought, I'm going to clear my diary. I have to be here because it's such a huge honour and privilege to be a part of today's celebration. And I'd like to start by paying my own tribute to Professor Jean Golding, today's guest of honour. Jean has had a profound and long-lasting influence on my entire career, but until today, we'd never actually met in person, although over the years, I've had the wonderful opportunity of hearing Jean speak on several occasions. ALSPAC was born just as I was starting out in my clinical academic career. And as you'll hear from my talk, Jean's work has influenced my thinking, I think the direction of travel of my research group, and more recently, and ultimately, the strategy of the birth cohort that we've recently established in Liverpool, and I'll speak briefly about that shortly. So, Professor Golding, happy birthday when it eventually arrives. It's an honour and a privilege to be with you today. And on behalf of the entire lifecourse research community in the UK and beyond, thank you so much for your work. Its impact, as Evelyn said, has been profound, and its legacy will endure. So, what I'd like to do with the next half hour or so is take us on a very quick canter through the history of birth cohorts and through the lens of an obstetrician, that's me, who has accidentally fell into wondering what happens to the baby when I've gone back to bed and delivered the baby, what actually happens. And with the usual apologies that, like any history, it's not a comprehensive overview, but rather just a collection of thoughts and highlights, and with some focus on my own group's research. And that will hopefully set the stage for Professor Golding's remarks later on what comes next for research across the life course. And so I'd like to start with a tale of two birth cohorts that were in fact never supposed to be birth cohorts at all. So in the 1940s, cardiovascular disease was the #1 cause of mortality amongst Americans, accounting for almost 1 in 2 deaths, which is, when you think about it, staggering. And prevention and treatment were so poorly understood that most Americans simply accepted their fate of premature death from heart disease as being completely unavoidable. Until Franklin D. Roosevelt, the 32nd wartime president of the United States, came about. And he proved to be no exception from this national epidemic. We now suspect that Franklin D. Roosevelt suffered from heart disease due to undiagnosed and largely untreated, unrecognized risk factors for most of his adult life. And in fact, as is still the tradition today, whilst he was running for election in 1932, his medical records were published, and his campaign office released, a full detail showing that his blood pressure was 140 over 105. Now, for the medics in the audience, you'll know that that's unacceptably high. But not only did no one pass comment, it just went unremarked on completely. And in fact, the following year, when he was president-elect, he actually selected an ENT, ear, nose and throat physician, as his personal physician. Now, no disrespect to my ENT colleagues who do very valuable work, but a gentleman in his 50s with a blood pressure of 140 over 105 probably needs something other than his ears syringing. So his blood pressure and, in fact, his cardiovascular disease essentially went untreated. But his physical deterioration did not go unnoticed. To many, it was very evident. And in fact, when the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, visited the White House in 1943, halfway through the war, accompanied, as you do, by his own personal physician, he asked his personal physician, had he noticed that the president was a very tired man, which, as euphemisms go, is right up there. In 1945, 2 months before Franklin D. actually succumbed, Roosevelt attended the Yalta Conference with Churchill and with Stalin to negotiate the anticipated post-war management of Germany and to talk about starting the United Nations. And the same personal physician to Churchill, Lord Charles Moran, was on that trip. And he wrote in his diary, and I quote, "The president appears to me to be a very sick man. He has all the symptoms of hardening of the arteries. And more worryingly, I give him only a few months to live." And that turned out to be an incredibly accurate prediction, because within 2 months, President Roosevelt died on April the 12th in 1945 at the age of just 63 from a cerebral hemorrhage with a documented blood pressure on admission to hospital of 300 over 190. So like countless of Americans that had gone before him, he succumbed to the national epidemic of cardiovascular disease. But it doesn't end there. There is a sort of upbeat end to this sad tale. His death in office at the relatively young age of 63 and just at the closure of the war prompted an outpouring of grief across the Allied world. And it brought into sharp focus, for the American population at least, that no one was spared from this national epidemic of cardiac disease. And probably as a direct result of Franklin D. Roosevelt's premature death, his one-time vice president and then the next president of the United States, Harry Truman, the 33rd president, who succeeded him, signed into law just a few years later the National Heart Act. And this is widely acknowledged by most people to be that direct response to the shock of having lost a serving president in office and one of his closest friends. And in the Act of Congress, it declared, whereas the Congress hereby finds and declares that the nation's health is seriously threatened by diseases of the heart and circulation, including high blood pressure. These diseases are the main cause of death in the US, and more than 1 in every 3 of our people die from them. So as a consequence of that act, the law allocated an astonishing amount of money for the time of $500,000 for a 20-year epidemiological heart study. And in the same act, it also established what was then called the National Heart Institute, and which colleagues in the audience will know is today known as the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute. So, meanwhile, as legislators were drafting the National Heart Act, the US Public Health Service, in anticipation of this grant funding coming on stream, delegated a young officer and physician, Dr. Meadows, to write a proposal for a future epidemiological study. Dr. Meadows set the tone for the next 65 years in that study by proposing to study the expression, and I quote, of coronary artery disease in a normal or unselected population to determine the risk factors that predispose to the development of the disease through clinical exam and long-term follow-up. Now, a fun fact when I went back into the archives to look at the original grant proposal was that they had a budget request of $95,000 startup funds to cover office supplies. And in that were several items, including ashtrays to cover the smoking needs of the study's staff members, which obviously dates the study somewhat. There was a lot of discussion at the time about where this study should be conducted, and a couple of physicians working out of Mass General and affiliated to Harvard Medical School made a really strong pitch that this epidemiological study should be located in Framingham, Massachusetts. The state was primarily considered ideal because of its proximity to Harvard, and that has echoes of the Golden Triangle here in the UK. But they also pointed out that Framingham was an excellent place because of the proximity of many cardiologists. At the time, there were less than 100 specialist cardiologists in the whole of the United States, and the majority of them were based at Harvard. It was also pointed out that Framingham, somewhat earlier, had conducted a large TB study 20 years previously and had shown excellent participation. It was a one-time farming community, but by the late 1940s was a factory town of about 28,000, predominantly white, predominantly middle-class residents of largely European descent. And their general occupation was in the general motor trade and producing rugs and paper products. So that was deemed to be representative of the whole United States. And after a bit of to and forth, essentially Framingham was finalised as the study site, and the Framingham Heart Study was born. Framingham is now over 75 years old. The Framingham risk score is known and used throughout the world. And whilst with the benefit of hindsight and some 21st century science, we now acknowledge it was a far from perfect study, and I'll talk about that briefly, there can be no doubting its impact. Thanks to Framingham and studies that came afterwards, we have identified and actually quantified, or at least semi-quantified, the risk between, or the link between hypertension and cardiac disease. And this was followed by studies linking cholesterol, diet, physical inactivity, obesity, atrial fibrillation, and ultimately smoking. So those ashtrays were no doubt thrown away, with heart disease and stroke. And thanks to the work conducted in this study, trials of interventions such as statins, antihypertensives, and anticoagulation quickly followed. And the net result is that from 1950 to now, mortality from cardiac disease has fallen by a staggering 60%. Meanwhile, in the UK, we were wrestling in the late 1930s with an entirely different problem at the other end of the life spectrum. In the 1930s, scientists in the UK were incredibly concerned about a half-century of falling birth rate. It had fallen consistently for over 50 years. And there was a very real fear that without urgent intervention, the British Empire would become extinct. Imagine. The Population Investigation Committee, which is actually a spin-out of the Eugenics Society, were actually tasked with investigating this thorny issue of what was driving the falling birth rate. And there was a strong sense, actually, amongst physicians that in the years before the NHS, the cost of having children, both financial and physical, was so great that parents were deterred, that people were deterred from parenthood. So a survey was crafted to look into the reasons behind the low birth rate, investigating firstly the real world cost of childbirth, and secondly, the availability, the use and the effectiveness of maternity services. Now, the work was inevitably interrupted by the war, but in 1946, under the auspices of the now legendary Professors Glass and Douglas, the National Maternity Survey was launched. And during a very wintry week in March of 1946, district health visitors set out to collect two paper forms, Dan, pre-digital, on the nearly 17,000 babies that were born in that 1 week period. And they actually ended up collecting 13,678 forms, a really impressive recruitment rate by any standard. The first finding of the National Maternity Survey was that the fears about the falling birth rate were completely unfounded. The end of the war resulted in a massive baby boom, and the survey actually captured data from the very first of the baby boomer generation. But the survey did detail in really horrific, grim detail the reality of giving birth before the foundation of the NHS. And if anyone has not read this report, I really urge you to. It is astonishing. The very first publication, a book published in 1948, coincided with the birth of Prince Charles, and it's widely thought that the book actually captured the imagination of the population because of the birth of the baby prince. Although the circumstances that the Prince Charles was born into are very, very different to the grim reality of childbirth for the overwhelming population of the United Kingdom at the time. And the report details the very considerable geographic and socioeconomic differences in health and survival of newborns and their parents, and the overall cost of childbirth. And in so doing, it actually primarily helped shape the maternity policies of the new NHS. But thanks to Professor Douglas, what was envisaged as a once-off maternity survey quickly became a birth cohort. And since 1946, there have been 25 successive waves of sampling the Douglas babies as they became known. And there have been 8 books and countless publications, peer-reviewed publications over the years. Subsequent waves in childhood reported positive associations that we now take for granted as common knowledge between health and survival, growth, development and morbidity, with family circumstances at birth, and health services care showed the beneficial impact of things like health visitors, which meant that the initial experiment within the NHS was continued. Findings on educational attainment showed the power of parental interest and concern for their child's ultimate outcome. It's also clear that adverse socioeconomic circumstances at birth reduce the longer-term educational attainment of children, regardless of their cognitive ability. Waves taken in adult years have gone on to show the effects of the growth trajectory in childhood and body weight change in adulthood on a range of non-communicable diseases, including blood pressure, adult obesity, cognitive function, midlife muscle strength, and ultimately frailty in old age. More recent work has looked at effects on the menopause and breast cancer, and related studies have shown the effects of early growth and breastfeeding on the timing of things like the menopause and adult cognition. It is almost impossible to overstate the impact that this one cohort has had on the health and actually health policy of the UK in the second half of the 20th century. But in summary, much like Framingham, we owe significant amount of the progress we've made in reducing perinatal infant and child mortality to what became known ultimately as the National Survey of Health and Development. But as I said, neither study was perfect, and neither study was initially intended to be a birth cohort at all. Framingham started life as a 20-year cohort study of adults, but subsequent waves have included children and now grandchildren of the original participants. The National Maternity Study was conceived as a once-off national cross-sectional study, but thanks, as I mentioned, to Prof. Douglas and his team, the amazing opportunity to longitudinally follow what became affectionately known as those Douglas babies was not lost forever. I mentioned that Framingham was chosen as it was thought at the time to be representative of the United States, but we now recognise that the States is much more diverse, particularly ethnically, than the predominantly white middle-class northeastern town of Framingham, particularly as it was in the late 1940s. And so Framingham has subsequently been enriched with waves that have deliberately recruited additional non-white participants. The National Maternity Survey was probably more representative of the UK at the time, given its very high recruitment rates. But unfortunately, and in a lesson that all cohorts have learned the hard way ever since, those most vulnerable and were those most likely to be missed by the health visitors. And in the case of this survey, we now know that the missing cohort included a greater proportion of children born to mothers who gave them up for adoption, children of mothers who died in childbirth, and children of mothers who declined any interaction with the health services post-birth. And that's the lesson that I think pertains today. So in the 1940s, when these studies were designed, the final thing that I want to focus on is that there was no consideration whatsoever given to capturing biological samples. But of all the flaws of these two studies, I think this is the one that we should forgive. Because few people could have predicted in the 1940s the pace of scientific progress, particularly in genetics in the second half of the 20th century. The structure of DNA, which is described in 1953, followed by the sequencing of the human genome 50 years later, were events that the founding fathers of both Framingham and the National Maternity Survey couldn't possibly have foreseen. Nor can we criticise the absence of any consideration of the in utero experience when the two studies were originally designed. David Barker's seminal paper describing a correlation between birth weight and heart disease wasn't published until 1986. The Barker hypothesis was refined and published just as I was starting medical school. And at the time of sitting in my first year lectures, the research field of DOAD, the developmental origins of health and disease, in which I was subsequently to spend much of my academic career, had yet to even be named. But by the time I was leading my own research group just a few years later, the theory underpinning this discipline was so mainstream that it made the cover of Time magazine. But it hasn't stopped there. Continuing work, much of it originating within ALSPAC and the huge and fantastic resource that Jean designed, has led to new questions. Is the brain really spared, as the Barker hypothesis originally suggested? Is it just in utero starvation that causes generational effects, or can other endogenous and perhaps environmental factors influence developmental programming? And does the mother's mental state affect the baby in the way that her physical state can? And this is where my own research group picked up the baton. So the belief that the psychological status of the mother during pregnancy can impact upon the health and well-being of her unborn baby is really deeply ingrained in many cultures over many, many centuries. Historical literature from ancient traditions of China, India, Arabia, many other cultures around the world, which all have common themes, and that's that the woman's mood and behaviour can adversely affect her unborn baby. And this common belief that in pregnancy, a woman's state of mind can adversely affect her unborn baby led to the general practice, again common to many ancient cultures, that women were to be confined during pregnancy and protected from cruelty or bad thoughts. And from trauma and shock. Now, I really got interested in this theory when I was a junior doctor and had two babies whilst working in the very high-octane specialty of obstetrics in the early 1990s, often working 56-hour shifts and frequently more than 100 hours a week. And I often think as a direct consequence of that, my second baby spent a not very pleasurable 8 weeks on the special care baby unit in the hospital where I worked. And so it's probably not that difficult to understand why I started to contemplate the effect of stress on fetal outcomes. And I didn't need to look too far. The concept of maternal psychological stress mediating adverse outcomes for the unborn baby was really revived in the 20th century. And as we're all aware, there are several large-scale man-made experiments which have presented a really unique opportunity to study this in a significant way, to see whether there is any actual factual base for these ancient traditions. We had atomic bomb exposure at the end of the Second World War, several national famines, including perhaps most famously the Dutch famine of 1944, several other wars, including Vietnam, in which women were particularly exposed. And those cohorts of women in subsequent years have provided evidence that population level exposure to significant psychological stress has a broad range of effects on babies who were unborn, but exposed to that stress in utero. And, bringing things right up to date, we're now all aware of the data emanating from the 9/11 birth cohort in New York. Now, these various birth cohorts have been intensively studied, and the offspring of mothers exposed to the atomic bomb, war, famine, all these traumas have been found to have a really diverse array of adverse outcomes, ranging from immediate obstetric complications, such as a high rate of preterm birth and fetal growth restriction, also to later metabolic syndrome, and then much later adult onset of really quite serious disorders, including schizophrenia. But the fundamental problem with all these large cohort studies is that the general exposures are really complex and what we call dirty exposures in epidemiology, in so much as that they consist of a mixture of potentially detrimental effects, such as radiation, malnutrition, toxin exposure. So it's therefore impossible to be completely precise about the overall contribution of psychological stress to in utero programming. And in addition, population level exposures don't really allow for the examination of individual subjects' risk factors or stresses, such as their genetic pedigree, their family history. And so it's not possible to control for all potential confounders. So in the last decade or so, last couple of decades, epidemiological research has really concentrated on searching for clean exposures of psychological stress with really robust and well-defined phenotypes of individual adverse outcome. And researchers, including many in this room, have studied all sorts of models to see if we can identify the perfect model in which we can address confounders, as well as critically investigate things like the temporal nature of the stress and whether it's dependent on other factors such as fetal gender. And that led me and my research group to Denmark to collaborate with colleagues working at the Danish National Centre for Register-Based Research at Aarhus University. We set out to investigate whether maternal psychological stress is associated with adverse pregnancy outcomes and also later adverse outcomes for those children when they grow up. Now, we went to Denmark because the Danish registers are world famous. National archiving by hand of individuals' citizens' data was actually started in Denmark in 1924. But the system really came into its own with the advent of electronic records and the introduction of the civil registration system and the CPR number in 1968. So the CPR number is unique. It's allocated at the time of birth or at the time of immigration into Denmark. It's not only unique to each individual, but it also contains really vital demographic data. And the critical thing is that it is linked to legal parents. The CPR number is also linked to siblings, and at the point of marriage, it becomes linked to the spouse's CPR number. CPR number is used for all civil transactions, such as payment of taxes, and it's also used for any interaction with state social security services and for all medical encounters. And the system is now updated daily. So it is an amazing resource. Now, there are numerous registers containing data which are uploaded to the CPR number, but the ones relevant for the data I'm about to share are the Medical Birth Register, which has almost 100% coverage and contains really detailed information on each birth, including the mode of delivery, the weight of the baby, infant sex, and gestational age. The Psychiatric Central Register, which includes data on all admissions to psychiatric hospital or admissions to general hospitals, but with a psychiatric diagnosis. And the Hospital Discharge Register, which includes data on all hospital discharges. So we set out to investigate initially whether maternal stress could affect fetal growth in utero. We asked ourselves, does prenatal psychosocial stress cause any detrimental effect on the growth of the fetus at any point in pregnancy? If there is an observed association, is the timing of the stress important? Is the type of the exposure important? And is there any gender-related effect? Are boy babies or girl babies more vulnerable than the other gender? We gave really considerable thought as to how we would define stress. And after much discussion, we decided we would define stress as bereavement or the development of a really serious illness, such as cancer or a heart attack, in first-degree relatives. So using the hospital registers, we were able to identify women who were pregnant during the study period, who before their pregnancy, in the 6 months prior to their pregnancy, or at any point in their pregnancy, were exposed to either the death or the serious life-threatening illness of a first-degree relative, a sibling, a child, a spouse, or a parent. We use linear regression to assess the effect of the exposure on birth weight, and log linear binomial regression was used to look at the effect of stress on the incidence of small for gestational age, which was defined as birth weight less than the 10th centile. Now, I'll go through this quickly because I have a series of slides that all look the same, but essentially do demonstrate largely similar findings. So we found that the death of a relative during any trimester of pregnancy or in the 6 months before conception was associated with an overall reduction in birth weight of 27 grams. Now, that may not sound that significant, but when we looked at the risk of having a small for gestational age baby, we also found that exposure at any time was associated with a 17% increase in the risk of having a baby that was small for gestational age. And although the risk varied in terms of its severity, it was present throughout pregnancy and in the 6 months pre-conception. That was a really unexpected finding. And when we published it, it generated a huge amount of interest and concern. And I spent a lot of time on the phone, largely to the Daily Mail, who wanted to run a headline saying, "Maternal stress kills your baby." And it was a great lesson for me in the importance of media and science communication, and a very hard lesson to learn. We went on to look at preterm birth next, and this is my big bugbear because, as I shared with you, my second baby was born preterm, and I've long believed that it was something to do with the stress that I was experiencing at work. So, this is where real life meets research. We used exactly the same methodology, and again, we found that death or serious illness of a relative preceding conception was associated with an overall 16% increase in risk of a subsequent preterm birth. So interestingly, stress after conception during pregnancy wasn't associated with the same risk. And you'll notice that we don't have a late pregnancy exposure because all these mums gave birth preterm, so they couldn't be exposed in late pregnancy. So that led us to conclude that catastrophic stress preconception and at any point in pregnancy is associated firstly with a risk of having a small for gestational age baby, and the risk appeared independent of fetal gender. And secondly, catastrophic stress in the preconception period, but not in pregnancy itself, was associated with an elevated risk of preterm birth. And those findings set off a whole cascade of mechanistic studies in my research group that we're still working on today. But I'll go on now to share our findings on maternal stress and psychiatric disorders, because this was the next question we wanted to ask. We were very concerned about the idea that stress in pregnancy could alter the development of the fetal brain at critical time points in its development. So we first decided to look at schizophrenia, and we chose schizophrenia because it's a very serious, lifelong, and very disabling condition. It is known to be associated with abnormalities of brain development and structure and function. Twin studies had previously suggested 85% concordance in identical twins. But it was increasingly believed to be a predominantly polygenic condition that was influenced by environmental risk factors because it wasn't 100% concordant. And so we decided that this would be an ideal model to see if stress in pregnancy was one of those environmental factors. The other reason why we wanted to look at schizophrenia is that those natural experiments I previously just talked about in terms of Avon exposure and the Dutch famine, etc., had also shown that babies born in those cohorts had a higher risk of schizophrenia in later life. But as I previously explained, they were dirty exposures, and those natural experiments, those large cohorts in populations, were unable to account for confounders. And no previous studies had examined the very pure phenotype that we wanted to look at. So we used exactly the same methodology. We defined stress as exposure in a first-degree relative to death or serious illness in that mother, sibling, child, or spouse combo. We used exactly the same registers, at this time including the psychiatric register. And we were able, through the CPR number, to link that exposure to birth and then onwards to psychiatric diagnosis. Now, we had to use a much larger cohort over a much longer period of time. And the period of follow-up was also much longer because schizophrenia often doesn't present until adulthood, late teens and early adulthood, and sometimes into the third or fourth decade. So it was a very large and very complicated study. And because of the rate of schizophrenia, which is thankfully not a common condition, we needed to capture the biggest possible amount of births. So we had 1.38 million births in the entire cohort. And again, you've seen charts like this before, but you will see, to our surprise, that exposure, either before pregnancy or in the second and third trimester, didn't have much of an effect, certainly a non-significant effect. But exposure in the first trimester during that critical period of gestation when the fetal brain is undergoing most active growth was associated with a very strong and significant risk of development of schizophrenia in adult life. The elevation in risk, as I say, was confirmed that period in pregnancy where the brain is undergoing rapid gyration and development. The sample size was too small to actually look at gender differences because schizophrenia, as I say, is thankfully uncommon. And we were also unable to test whether it was specific just for schizophrenia or whether other associated psychiatric disorders were also involved. We then set out to look at affective disorders, much more common. Depression is a very common group of mental illnesses. It's very disabling, and we now know, we didn't know in the early noughties when we embarked on this work, but we now know that we're in the middle of a mental health epidemic. So this work is probably more pertinent today than it was when we set out to do it. But we know that affective disorders are associated with significant morbidity and mortality in terms of suicide and lives lost. Studies had previously showed a hereditary predisposition, but again, it's probably polygenic, it's probably quite complex, and there almost certainly is an environmental overlay. So it made it very suitable for the kind of experiment we were talking about. And again, we used exactly the same methodology. We went way back in the Danish registers. We gathered the largest possible cohort, this time of 1.1 million births, same exposure, death or serious illness in a first-degree relative. And we broke it up looking at the timing of exposure, either pre-pregnancy or in the first, second or third trimester. And again, you've seen charts like this. And in this situation, we showed that exposure was associated with a significant risk of affective disorders in adult life when it occurred in the second trimester. There's a trend throughout pregnancy, but it was non-significant until you get to the second trimester. So a very timing specific effect on the later development of affective disorders. So that led us to conclude that there are very specific, gestationally time-specific and limited effects on the fetal brain during pregnancy that are mediated by psychosocial stress in the mother. And there did seem to be a gender difference. Boy babies in general were more vulnerable to this exposure than female babies. But back to my day job. I deliver babies for a living, and the kind of stress that we're talking about in the Danish registers is catastrophic and thankfully not very common. My real concern was this mother, the mother that is late for her antenatal appointment, can't make it because she's got a very busy job, is constantly on her phone, constantly worried about childcare, the kind of bread and butter of the clinics that we see every day in Bristol, Liverpool and elsewhere. And so we started to think about how can we really dig into this and examine both the subtle effects of stress, but also underlying mechanistic studies. And at this point, I thought I'd share with you this, that my daughter-in-law sent me last week. Problems that were overblown, and this is definitely my childhood. When I think about the amount of time I worried in childhood about quicksand and the Bermuda Triangle, and I know my parents worried about people offering me drugs, things that I wasn't warned about, unexpected items in the bagging area, remembering my passwords and existential stress and dread. But I put this up because I think it reminds all of us cohort researchers that it's really difficult to predict the future. We can't be critical of the forefathers of Framingham and the National Maternity Survey for not taking any biological samples, because the word biobank wasn't used in the literature until 1992, which is a fun fact. So, you know, when you think about how we spent our childhood worrying about quicksand, I think we can give them a free pass on that. So do we really need another birth cohort? There have been 60 cohorts since the 1946 cohort. They're all listed in a fantastic registry on the MLC website. If you haven't looked at it, I urge you to. But there was never one in Liverpool where I currently work. And I'll talk a little bit about why we think Liverpool is special in this for this reason in a minute. There's never been a cohort born in a post-Brexit and now a digital age. And when we actually wrote the grant that subsequently funded the cohort I'm about to share with you, we were pre-pandemic. Little did we know when we sent that grant in that by the time we launched the cohort, it would be the first post-pandemic cohort. Some of the wonderful cohorts that have gone before us and which have in every way, shape and form informed the work that we've done are listed on the left, starting with the 1946 study. But I think it's fair to say that the cohort that we closely identify with and from which we have learnt the most, from which we have harmonised to in every possible way, is ALSPAC. And as Nick knows, who's on our scientific advisory board and is very familiar with our study, we are in awe of what has happened in Bristol, and we hope that we can mimic it in Liverpool and take it to the next stage of its development, but hopefully avoiding questions about quicksand. So our aim when we set out was to think uniquely about Liverpool. Liverpool is I'm a Scouser, so I have a bias, and I'll I'll declare that right up front. But I think Liverpool is a really special place. It's a city that was deliberately politically left behind in the 1980s. And as a consequence, it's got probably the most marked socioeconomic disparity in the UK. Depending on which chart you look at, it's us or Glasgow. And it's not a chart that you want to be the top of in any way, shape or form. It's a city that has a large urban and rural split. Many people don't realise that Liverpool City is quite a dense urban conurbation, but we have a rural hinterland just on our doorstep. It's a coastal area, and we now know from various epidemiological studies that coastal towns, particularly those in the north, have their own unique set of socioeconomic challenges. So we were very convinced that Liverpool was a good place for a new birth cohort. The second thing about Liverpool, and I say this as a proud Scouser, is that it's got a very high rate of research participation. Studies that have gone before us, like UK Biobank and 100,000 genomes, over-recruited in Liverpool. Scousers actually have, in this day and age, quite a touching and almost unique trust in their civic organisations. They may not ever attend the university, but they're very proud of it. They believe and trust in their NHS. The flip side of that is that when you lose trust in Liverpool, it's gone forever. And if any of you have ever visited our city, you'll know that you can't buy a copy of the Sun newspaper within a 30-mile radius of the city centre. So it's a very special place to do this kind of research. So we set out to think, what's new and what's different? What is the unexpected item in the bagging area of 20 years' time? And when we set out to design this study in 2018, we decided to focus on mental health, because a lot of the studies that had gone before have done really, really good work in mental health. But when they were designed, they were in a different time, before the mental health epidemic that we're currently facing, before social media, before all the challenges that today's generation have to face. So we made mental health our #1 priority. We also wanted to look at the intersection with non-communicable diseases. And actually post-pandemic, we've also wanted to look at the intersection of communicable and non-communicable diseases. We wanted to look at developmental delay. We know that in Liverpool, many children reach the age of 4 and they are not school ready. So this was a particular focus for the study. And we wanted to place a great emphasis on the holistic measurement of children in their entire system. 1 in 9 children at some point in certain areas of our city spend time in the care system. And we wanted to make sure that we captured those children as they came in and out of that system so that we could look and measure and assess every aspect of their environment. So Seagull is a cohort of 10,000 infants and their parents or other caregivers in triad design. It's based out of a single centre, the Liverpool Women's Hospital, but fully embedded in dedicated community hubs in parts of the city that are traditionally recognised as being hard to reach or that have low participatory rates. We initially planned to recruit over 4 years, and we have our own dedicated clinical research team of lab techs, study management, expertise and research midwives. And those of you familiar with ALSPAC will know that this sounds all very, very familiar for a very deliberate reason. We're currently funded to study these kids up to the age of 2, but obviously we are hoping that we will be able to continue to study them beyond that time frame. One of the unique things about Seagull, and one of the few advantages that the pandemic gave us, was that 4-year delay allowed us to stand up a central linked data collection system that was actually funded by our city council. So our city council gave us £5 million worth of match. Our city council looked at Bristol. They liked what happened here, and they could see that that ALSPAC had benefited the city of Bristol significantly, and Liverpool wanted a piece of that action. So they happily gave us £5 million to develop a civic data co-op. And this has enabled us to perform, to set up a complete data linkage system within the city region or in the environment within which these babies are born. And it will essentially allow us to look at not just data linkage between, for example, GP records and hospital data, but also school data and other civil records. And it'll allow us to therefore interrogate the data in depth. So to be eligible for Seagull, we're approaching all mums who are 16 and over with their ongoing pregnancy booked for care in a single centre. And I would say just a quick word about the single centre. I think that's really important, and it was another lesson that we took from ALSPAC. Colleagues may know that other studies have tried to do something similar since on a national level and haven't succeeded. And I think that sense of place is really important. The people of Liverpool have a great deal of pride in Seagull, and it feels like it's a Liverpool study. It's of Liverpool for Liverpool, but also for the international scientific community. And if we had a national study, I'm not sure we would be able to rely on that sense of place and belonging and pride in the study. So much like ALSPAC, we take consent in early pregnancy, we're collecting data throughout pregnancy, and we have an extensive biobank aligned to this study. We've also made a very big deal about collecting data from dads and other caregivers. Other studies that went before have not spent as much time looking at other caregivers and dads in non-normative families as perhaps they might now wish they had. So we've learned from that, and we've made a special attempt to gather as much data from dads and other caregivers as possible. This is just a quick schematic diagram showing what we're collecting and when. We first see mums at 12 weeks, we follow them through pregnancy, and we're currently taking samples at 2 time points in pregnancy, once at delivery, and then we're doing microbiome sampling, and I'll say a brief word about that before I close, at day 7, at 1 month, 3 months, and 12 months, and again at 24 months when our funding runs out. We have very extensive amounts of information on our website, and I won't go through all of this in detail in the interest of time, but if you are interested in the data collection SOPs, please do get in touch. You can find most of the information on our website, but we'd be happy to share them with you. You will see a huge amount of overlap with ALSPAC, and that is very deliberate because we're trying to harmonise and add to what has gone before. But what we are particularly pleased with is the very detailed data collection we're taking on mental health measures, both from mums and dads, but also from children. Obviously, we won't be able within the current funding envelope to look at significant perinatal mental ill health before the age of 2, but we are hopeful that by doing repeated measures, we'll be able to see very early trajectories to later mental ill health in childhood. And clearly our funder agrees because it's a #1 priority for them as well. We're seeing children in the community, and I just want to say a quick word and a thank you to everyone in the room who has helped us in terms of designing the follow-up. The information we've had from ALSPAC researchers has really helped us in terms of our outreach and our activities in terms of engaging with the community, and it's been absolutely transformational for our study. So finally, I'll close just by flagging that Seagull, like all good programmes, is delivered in partnership with our funder, with our NHS, our Civic Data Co-op and NIHR, but also with the amazing researchers at the Sanger at UCL and at the Milk Lab in Manitoba. And I'd also just like to thank ALSPAC again and Jean for having the vision to fund this amazing national and indeed international resource in the first place. Hopefully, I've demonstrated in my talk how influential it's been to me as a researcher, to my entire research group, and now to the City of Liverpool, because we've embarked on something that were it not for Jean, we would never have gone there. And I bring the thanks of my entire city and our funders to this celebration. So Jean, thank you.
Great. So in this session, we have 4 speakers, and we end with some words from Jean. Great. So I'd like to welcome to the stage our first speaker, and that's Eunice Lo.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's my great honor to be here, honestly, just be in the room, let alone speak here as an early career scientist. A lot of you won't know me because I'm a climate scientist, but I'm interested in the intersection between climate change and human health. And I lead a small pilot project with ALSPAC about understanding people's lived experience of extreme weather events. And this is what I'm going to talk about here. So this is a collaboration between climate scientists like myself, but also humanities and also ALSPAC. And also recently, we've got JGI data science expertise in the team as well, looking at the data that we've collected through these pilots surveys about extreme weather events in ALSPAC. Right, so again, I'm a climate scientist, so I'm going to start with climate change and climate impacts on people. So this is a screen capture from the last climate change risk assessments by the Climate Change Committee for the UK about adaptation of the UK to climate change. As you can see here, heat is one of the highest priorities for adaptation to climate change in the UK. Especially, here's a sentence about we need to adapt to the risks to human health, well-being and productivity from increased exposure to heat in homes and also other buildings. Red color indicates high risk, and you can see this is a time series from 2020 up until the end of this century, and it's all red. So it's a high priority, high risk in the UK. But also cold temperatures also kill a lot of people. So this is a graph from one of my papers from earlier this year. So here we see a time series of COVID mortality, so it's daily mortality from COVID-19 in the last, so in 2020 to 2022. And then that's the purple line, and the blue line is daily mortality from cold temperatures in England and Wales. Red line is that from hot weather, also in England and Wales, aggregated across the both nations. So you can see peaks in COVID-19 mortality, as we all know about it, but also peaks in mortality associated with non-optimal temperatures from cold and from heat in different times in the year. And on the right-hand side there, you can see when England had 40.3 degrees Celsius as a record-breaking temperature in England. That was when heat-related mortality peaked as well. So it's about 600 deaths in a day. So it's a massive mortality burden in the UK. But what we know a lot less is what we can't see from hospital data or mortality or certificates of deaths, which is how these extreme weather events also affect people's lived experience, people's well-being in the home, people's productivity at the workplace, and so on. Those can't be revealed in the data that we collect from the ONS or NHS, and this is why we've developed new kind of responsive surveys through ALSPAC to ask about extreme weather events. So we deployed 2 surveys so far, both of them from late last year or early this year. So the first one, we asked about people's lived experience during the September heat wave last year. So although we don't really have hot temperatures currently, but this time last year, we had 7 consecutive days of hot weather in September, which is quite unusual. The hot weather was over 30 degrees somewhere in England for 7 consecutive days. There was amber heat health alerts during that time. So we also wanted to know whether people knew about the alerts in the UK, and also what they did about knowing of alerts or the warnings. We also then thought, why did we want to focus on heat if we also know that cold has a lot of impacts on people's health? So we subsequently deployed another survey asking similar questions, but about the cold weather and the stormy weather in January 2024, so early this year. So that was, I think across the UK, there were 600 flood warnings. Storm Hank was one of them, and also sub-zero temperatures in a lot of places. Things are slightly overlapped that I didn't notice. But so we asked about people's aspects of their life, including their appetites, their moods, their productivity at home and work, and also did they sleep well and all of that. And they could choose whether it was worse or better, or there's no change. And then we also asked about, did they know about the alerts or what they did about it, and also provided free text opportunity for people to just write about the experience where we couldn't ask about, options. So I'm the climate scientist, so I don't know what to expect of how many responses to have actually, but we have over 3,000 responses to the heat survey, and then just nearly 3,000 for the cold survey, but I don't have time to go into the cold one. So this is the breakdown of the participants in the heat survey. So we gave them 14 days to respond. It's an online form, relatively short to fill out. So this is the age categories that we have. Because it's a birth cohort from the 90s, we expected this age breakdown in terms of getting quite a lot of participants in the 30s, but also a lot of participants in the 60s and 70s. We have a range of employment status, a lot of people employed or retired, and we also asked about the housing and what kind of areas they lived in, because we know that there's, for example, an urban heat island effect, so people living in cities are exposed to heat more. So this is basically the main result. So a lot of people gave us different answers for 8 categories in the aspects of life. And you can see what really stands out is that, for example, sleep quality comes out as one of the worst affected outcome, with 67% of the people answering they had worse sleep quality during the heat wave compared to the normal days. Productivity at home was also quite badly affected. And if you want to focus on some positives of the heat wave that's kind of out of season, quite a lot of people said that mood actually increased during that heat wave, but also similar amounts of people said mood was slightly worse. So that's something that we will look into. But this is the overall outcome of the survey. So we then particularly wanted to look at who was more likely to answer they had a worse aspect of life during the heat wave. So we looked at the gender differences, age differences, and also employment and housing types, and all the other socio-demographic characteristics that we could look at, and did some regression on those. And these came out as the aspects that would affect what's the likelihood of someone answering worse. So first of all, being female participants were more likely to say that the sleep quality and productivity at home being worse affected than male participants. These are, I'm only showing significant results here. Quite interestingly, when I usually look at mortality data, it is the older age group that's more affected in terms of physical health or morbidity and mortality. But in this survey, we're finding that the under 34-year-olds are reporting worse sleep quality and productivity at home, and many other aspects than the over 65 age group. So that's quite interesting to look into. Being unemployed or out of not working also has an increased likelihood of saying that they sleep worse and had worse productivity at home. And also living in a flat makes productivity at home worse for the participants rather than living in a detached house. We had a lot more statistics like this, but I don't have time to go into that. But in general, apart from age and gender, employment and housing type is also a significant impact on who is having worse aspects of life in a heat wave. Similar results are coming out from the cold one, and we also asked slightly more questions in the cold survey because we learned something from deploying the first survey. So we're also finding that having disability and also having pre-existing long-term health conditions consistently lead to higher likelihood of answering worse in all of these outcomes. So another thing that we asked about was whether people knew about any national heat health alerts that came out. It's quite interesting results. So over 80% of people said they knew about the alerts, but only 34% of them did something about the hot weather or the alert. And this is the breakdown of what they did. It's quite a small graph, I realize, but in general, people's behavioral change in response to the hot weather or the alert mainly could be categorized in changing their routine. So for example, walking the dog at later time when it's hot, taking personal care, wearing lighter clothing, for example, using technology, using a fan or air conditioning, for example. Adapting the home would be like closing curtains during the day, opening windows at night, and so on. So for the first time, we can really understand what are the behavioral changes that people make when there's extreme weather events that perhaps we didn't know before as from like quantitative data. So thank you very much, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So our next speaker, Heather Whalley, unfortunately can't be here because she is recovering in ICU from pneumonia. She sends her regards, and we of course send our best wishes. But surprisingly, we've had a volunteer to step in and give her talk. So I'd just like to welcome to the stage Alex Kwong. Thank you so much for this. And we'll just get to the slides. Here we go. Very much.
Thanks very much. So yeah, Heather was very excited to be here today, but unfortunately came ill very late yesterday and sent me the slides at 9 o'clock last night from hospital. So I don't really know what the slides are going to say, but I know she did have some very lovely text saying it was a pleasure to be here, and she was very inspired by the work that you did, Jean, and wanted to thank you personally for the way that you've influenced her career. So I don't actually have the exact text of what she said, but it was along those lines, and she was very grateful and pleasurable to be here. And if I could just add on something to that, is all of this research that we're going to present, it's all because of the work and the vision that you have. So thank you very much. And I wouldn't be here, and this research that we'll present wouldn't be done without you. So thank you very much. So Heather is a professor of psychiatry up in the University of Edinburgh, and she's really interested in mental health and youth mental health specifically. And so I'll just present some of the work that she's been talking about and she's interested in. So youth mental health is a bit of a, as we said, it's a bit of an epidemic. And we're starting to get this impression now that adolescence, particularly are part of youth mental health, is this really key area, it's really critical point for the development of life. And it's characterized by biological, social, and psychological changes, these really profound changes that happen. It's this critical period of life that can have devastating consequences downstream. So it's really important to understand how mental health changes and develops across time so that we can sort of present and understand and design better interventions and preventions that can prevent some of these outcomes. And so we see here that things like mood disorders, depression, anxiety, particularly prevalent during adolescence and childhood and as people get older. And it's not just that this is a problem at the time, it's a problem for downstream consequences, but they also have a really complex multifactorial basis. So take depression, for example, characterized by differences in genetic liability, social adversity, chronic illness, all these different factors having their time-specific and time-dependent impacts on things like depression. So what's really important to have is to understand sort of the mechanisms, of mental health, but also understand that depression will change over time, and it's about trying to develop time and specific interventions for those. And we have a lot of evidence from cross-sectional studies taking from one period of time, but we don't have a really good evidence base of longitudinal data, which is where studies like ALSPAC have been absolutely vital in improving that knowledge gap. So we'll talk about a few different things that Heather and myself are particularly interested in, and this is work led by a PhD student called Amelia up in Edinburgh. And the way that this longitudinal data really suits this kind of research question, so we were interested in the way that inflammation or high levels of chronic inflammation might be associated with the onset and persistence of depression and depressive symptoms over time. And what's really nice about this is that we have measures of things like interleukin-6, a measure of inflammatory markers, assessed before the onset of depression. So we can sort of identify if it's what you're not looking at with the cross-sectional studies, is it the inflammation that's causing depression or depression causing the inflammation? What we're able to do is untangle that direction with this longitudinal data. So we have these measures of inflammation at age 7 and 9, and then we have up to 11 waves of depression data going all the way from age 10 to 28. And I'm trying to pull Nick and Kate's arms here to try and get more depression data in the next few sweeps. But that's like almost 20 years worth of data, which is an unparalleled, unrivaled source of information. It allows you to do things like this, where on the left-hand side here, you can just see that higher levels of inflammation were associated with higher levels of depressive symptoms throughout adolescence and into early adulthood. And what the theme of this talk will be that we can use that benchmark, that framework that's developed in ALSPAC, and see how does that compare with other cohorts that have different kind of confounding structures, different kinds of measures, different kinds of studies. So what we actually did is we we used this longitudinal framework to look at how interleukin-6 preceded depression in ALSPAC, but then also tested it in UK Biobank, a large sample of 500,000 people where we didn't necessarily have that granularity and that reverse causation element to it, but we found similar results. And then this is some work led by Poppy, who's just sat over here as well from Edinburgh, looking at depression trajectories in relation to genetic risk. We know that genetics plays a significant part in depression and mood disorders. And what we're able to do is use really detailed information from the ALSPAC study to characterize depression trajectories, just on the left here, something that ALSPAC is particularly very good at and very efficient at, and how that's influencing other cohorts and how we can combine that data to triangulate evidence that we know we're probably more likely to tapping into real effects. So on the left is ALSPAC, and on the right-hand side is the ABCD study, a study in the US looking at longitudinal follow-up of 12,000 young people, but born 10, 20 years later. So we've got these generational differences, but what we see are similar effects in both the ALSPAC study and the ABCD study, where higher genetic risk for things like depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, anxiety, or lumping them all together to create a multi-trait risk of psychiatric disorders is associated with much higher and persistent depression trajectories. And that informs a lot of mechanistic understanding of what we think is going on with depression. Moving on to some other work that's led by Poppy as well, looking at the idea of specific symptoms and whether or not targeting specific symptoms at specific times could be quite important, specific symptoms of depression. So understanding the idea depression is not just the presence or absence of depression, it's characterized by things like anhedonia, it's characterized by things like poor, lower concentration, feelings of suicidal ideology. Can specific symptoms tell us about depression, tell us about people over time, and are there specific symptoms that are correlated with one another, and can you target some of those specific symptoms to affect the overall understanding of depression? And we look here at something called network temperature, the idea that people's symptoms might change over time or they might be more consistent. And what we found is that network temperature as a parameter of whether or not someone's more likely to stay within their ways or whether they're more likely to be malleable, so we're actually able to target them. We found that people are more likely to be less stable as time goes on. And what we saw evidence was in ALSPAC, using that as the anchor cohort, but we saw that in replicated results in ABCD and in the Millennium cohort study. So another cohort in the UK, born around the age of 2000, Millennium, so followed up longitudinally, and we see these same results. So we're using ALSPAC as this anchor cohort to replicate results and triangulate evidence from all these different resources to try to tap into consistent effects. We were quite fortunate, Heather and I, to recently receive funding from Wellcome to develop a digital tool for understanding about mental health development over time. And this is part of Wellcome's mental health data prizes. And what we used ALSPAC for was for developing a tool called Tidal, tool to implement developmental analysis of longitudinal data. And what this tool does is it brings in raw data that you might have from a particular study. So we trained it in ALSPAC. We just took multiple assessments of things like the Strength and Difficulties questionnaire. And you bring in an Excel spreadsheet, a very, very raw, pre-processed bit of information, and Tidal will automatically create beautiful trajectories. I had to say beautiful because I made it. Beautiful trajectories that are easily accessible to people who don't necessarily have the experience or the time or the capacity to learn all of these complex methods. So it's a really easy facilitating tool that will allow you to go from raw data to trajectories and the inferences from these trajectories. And the point that why this is relevant to this talk is because ALSPAC, you could say, might be the gold standard of longitudinal data. But what we can also do is bring in other cohorts. And we see from using that framework, testing it on ALSPAC, trying to iron out all the kinks in a really good data set, allows you to replicate research in other different data sets as well. So we have data sets from Growing Up in Scotland, Millennium cohort study, the TEDS twin study, the ABCD study in the US, and then the Pelotas 2004 cohort in Brazil. And this was the kind of research question we were interested in, is are there differences in depressive symptoms and how they might diverge between males and females? And actually we see unbelievably, and one of the most compelling bits of research I think I've ever seen, of this gender divergence between males and females occurring during adolescence. Really consistent evidence across these cohorts that is facilitated by the work that we've done in ALSPAC. Okay, so there's a bit of time to talk about Generation Scotland, which is a kind of sister cohort to ALSPAC. It's a it is a longitudinal study, but it was set up to be just a cross-sectional study looking at the lives and health of people in Scotland. And it has all this different data on mental health, but also loads of physical health. But one of the key things is the ability to link to health records. And what Heather will have also liked to say is that there's now this next generation of participants, next generation Scotland. So following the offspring of those people. So now there's original 20,000 people. There's now 32,000 people, and that's hopefully going to be 40,000 people with the addition of new younger participants. And I think what Heather would like to say here is that this provides really nice opportunities to leverage some of that existing cohort work that was developed in ALSPAC to then move into more exciting and really novel ways of collecting data and understanding more about youth mental health development. So we have two different studies going on at the moment with Next Generation Scotland, which also leans into ALSPAC. So we have one which is about loneliness in the digital world, using smartphones to assess loneliness in the Next Generation Scotland participants and learning a lot of things from the ALSPAC data that influences that kind of study. We also have the study called Mental Health in the Moment, which is looking at Next Generation Scotland, ALSPAC and TEDS, and trying to do harmonized data collection on smartphones using subsamples from those people. So building on from that data that we had from, that life course history in ALSPAC, going into these people again, and then trying to collect data. So this is just, a very, very short-term. So it's like building in the long-term trajectory and the short-term trajectories as well. That life course history, along with immediate short-term trajectories over the course of a week or so. So just in summary, ALSPAC has been an incredibly useful tool for understanding more about youth mental health and has allowed us to learn more about critical periods, the ability to triangulate evidence, and there's this new exciting wave of opportunities to bring in some new cohorts, bring in new data and methods, and bring in new tools that will hopefully facilitate our understanding of youth mental health going forward. Thank you very much for your time, and great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was really great ad-libbing. So our next speaker is Anya Skatova, and she's going to tell us about shopping trolleys, but also she has an exhibit here that you can see, and please tell us about it.
Is it goes on its own? Thank you. Okay. Oh yeah. So hi everybody. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Anya Skatova. I'm Bristol Medical School, and my background is actually in psychology and behavioral science. I'm not epidemiologist, although I'm working a lot now on the similar questions to others in the room. There will be a plug for the shopping trolley secrets that we're doing with the curious. So I will spend some time convincing you that novel data can bring loads of exciting opportunities for longitudinal studies like ALSPAC. And I need to say that is only possible because of my work with ALSPAC when I moved to Bristol. It's kind of was the right time to start these conversations about novel data collection, and everything that I'm going to be talking about has been developed with ALSPAC, and certainly because of the opportunities created by Jean. So novel digital footprints data, it's something that all of us leave behind while we go about our everyday lives. So it's your phone data, it's your social media data, if you use it, it's banking data, it's also loyalty cards data. So all this new data provide us really interesting opportunities to look into people's behavior in a new way, which is not necessarily going to replace traditional data collections like survey, diary studies, but perhaps offer a new window into what people are doing on an everyday basis. And that's what I and my group Digital Footprints Lab is interested in. So why it's so exciting for a behavioral scientist like me to look in this novel digital footprints data? It kind of shifts the scale of the data to millions of individuals rather than to thousands, like in the best of cohorts. It can reflects real world behavior. So it's not self-report, a lab-based measure that, for example, I'm a psychologist used to. And it's quite dynamic. It's multiple measures per person and often continuous timescale, depending on which kind of data you look at. This scale is large, it's national samples, so although obviously not necessarily selected in a representative way, but perhaps there are ways to improve on that. And most importantly, it can bring impact into kind of changing the way we collect the evidence for effectiveness of policies and so on. Sorry, the slides are a bit kind of not as they looked at my computers. Sorry about that. So why this data is so important for public health? Well, from the surveys and other data collections, there's loads of important information missing, and in various domains. And here's just examples. So we know that mental health is often underreported because of social stigma. We know that people simply don't remember certain things of their daily behaviors, especially when they're routines, like, for example, food. You know, even the best food frequency questionnaire would miss out on this. How many cookies did you have, for example, today? Would you remember? Sometimes people forget those things. We also know quite little about behaviors that contribute to lifelong health, like, for example, infant feeding, type of infant feeding. Because of such a high pressure to breastfeed, we often underreport the way people actually do it at homes. And even though linking medical record into with other types of data provided a lot of insight into health outcomes, we still don't know what people do before they go to the doctor and how they treat the symptoms at home. And all this information could be available from other data sets, such as shopping data that we've been looking at. And I will just give you a glimpse of what's our kind of thinking behind it, and you can talk to me afterwards. So, so just imagine a time scale, and this is all kind of about shopping data, how it can be used for research. So just imagine time scale of somebody buying menstrual products roughly every 28 days. Actually, we can see it in the data. Then kind of stop buying those menstrual products and buying pregnancy tests, and then 9 months later start buying baby products. This is actually pretty consistently, easily detected event in people's life for shopping data. So having a baby, and supermarkets do it all the time. It's how they then start inviting you into parents' club and offer you vouchers and stuff. But obviously, as health researchers, we can capitalize on these patterns and study various events that occur alongside this timeline, which seem to be pretty consistent. So, for example, we can study physical health, and for example, if somebody is buying painkillers together with menstrual products, we can infer that they are suffering from menstrual pain. In fact, we have a project which led by my PhD student, Poppy, who's here, on the way people deal with menstrual symptoms. We can study everyday behaviors such as diet. So, for example, if we know that person is pregnant, through their data, we then can look at vitamins they're buying and so on, and then look how it affects their outcomes. And then we can study postnatal events, such as, for example, if people start buying mental health sort of sleep remedies, we can infer that there's some pressure on them and they might be suffering from some postnatal mental health events. And this is just the example of how you can analyze this data. But of course, nothing is really certain if you look just at the big data sets, and it's important to look at them together with other linked data. And that is why we have this project with ALSPAC that is quite big for me, but it became a pilot for linking shopping data into other cohorts. So the The way we do it, we've done quite a lot of work with ALSPAC of linking shopping data, now actually linked to the data, which is fantastic. But that preceding linkage was a lot of work on talking to participants and developing the right protocol, both ethically and legally, in linking this data. And it was only possible because of the special relationship ALSPAC has with participants. And this model will be then rolled out to other studies and other types of digital footprints data to enable us to validate those data and these patterns in the data in the same way I showed you. This is kind of inferred, but we also want to then correlate it with what we can find from other type of data linked into longitudinal data sets, such as health records or surveys, enabling us then to study various aspects of health, such as reproductive health, nutrition, and so on, self-medication. You know, there's loads of projects which we're interested in, and you can talk to me afterwards. We're interested in ultra-processed foods and cancer risk factors, social inequalities, alcohol consumption, and so on. One last thing I wanted to mention to you, that it's all really great about this new novel data, and there is loads of potential and loads of people that recognize it. However, this data belongs to the people, and we really need to ask people whether it's okay to use this data for research, because it hasn't been collected for research. I've done quite a bit of work with collaboration with others on concept of data donation, so whether people are happy to donate their data in the way, digital data in the way they would donate blood, and they generally are if they understand the purpose. But I think that is the key issue there, because usually people don't think about those data that much. So it takes quite a long time to kind of paint a picture why kind of sharing this data for research is important. And I wanted to invite you after this event downstairs to our collaboration with the Curious, which was kind of grew out of this work I've done with ALSPAC. And it's called Shopping Trolley Secrets. There's some snapshots of what you will see in the space. And it's more than public engagement. It's kind of the way to learn for us which research projects people are more comfortable to donate their data to, shopping data to. It's an opportunity to in-depth discuss ethical issues around using shopping data. And it actually helps us to shape our research practices, as some of this information is already going into our ongoing grants. There'll be QR codes and sign-up sheets for the little tour around the Open City Lab, where we have our exhibition. So please come. Just to say, it has been extremely popular. It's about over 13,000 people since July has attended the exhibition. So we've been really lucky so far, and people really want to talk about those issues. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. And just as a reminder for that, there is a sign up. There's a limited number of people that can go into the space. So if you're interested, you've received an email about it, but you can also use the QR code that's going to be put up at the end. Okay, so final session, we are shortly to hear from Jean, but to build tension and to do a proper introduction, we will hear from the director of ALSPAC. That's Nick Timpson.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Nick Timpson. Probably even worse than getting in the way of lunch is getting in the way of the main event, so I'll be as brief as possible. I'm a geneticist, and I use cohorts because I need data, and that was what really landed me at the doorsteps of ALSPAC. I needed data. I've latterly become involved in them much more regularly. I'm now very fortunate to be looking after the Children of the 90s study, which is an extraordinary privilege. I was trying to think about what it might relate to, and I could only think about the stereotypical dad driving their new child and mum who's just delivered out of that maternity suite, and just how worried you are about looking after something so precious. But that's kind of the day job now, and I'm very lucky. I also now know as a researcher how annoying I was to the ALSPAC team, constantly asking for data, constantly doing difficult and prickly genetic things, which were very annoying indeed. But the system could carry it and was incredibly valuable. So I'm just another one of the countless researchers who's built their career on this extraordinary legacy. You know that, you've heard about it today, you've heard about some fabulous examples and the really dynamic way that the study can now be applied. I would only add to that facilitation. Hundreds of millions of pounds of grants, not here, not been received by Bristol, but to researchers all over the world, built on the legacy that Jean set up. In addition to that, we get scores of people asking for the resource and the data. I think the average is something like 23 a month, still coming to the study regularly to use the resource. That's not just people who are established, it's also those who are starting their careers. PhDs, training, MScs is all coming through all the time. What an extraordinary legacy for something that has been set up by someone as forward-looking as Jean. What you probably don't hear talked about often is the day-to-day. Jean comes in all the time, every day. She's winning grants, doing research. We get to talk regularly about the future. It's amazing. What a thing to celebrate, the legacy that's gone and the continuing work. So without further ado, I'll step off the stage and invite Jean up, who's going to tell us a little bit about what's been done, but I hope cast her eye forward as well. So round of applause for Jean and congratulations.
Well, I'm overwhelmed by all the talks I've heard so far, and thank you all for coming. It's not a birthday I ever thought was a highlight. Who's ever heard of an 85th birthday party? But anyway, I've come around to thinking it's a very good thing to celebrate. So thank you all very much indeed. I, as you know now, have been trying to study the life course and looking back on it, and it is looking back a very long time. The thing that strikes me most is thinking about how the technology of studying the life course has changed. To start with, when I fell into studying a big cohort study, which was the 1958 National Birth Cohort, everything that I did was on Cope Chat cards, which you can see on the screen. One card was filled in for a particular participant, and then you filled in another card. And depending on the data that you'd got, which was off-paper questionnaires, you could code that in terms of punching a hole in the outside of the Cope chart. And then you would put a knitting needle through the holes that you wanted and shake, and you would get the pile of cards that you were interested in. And you knew your data intimately. I really regret that having passed, and still mentally do something like that. So that was how I started. I was also introduced to the 80-column punch cards, where you had a card per participant, and the columns were related to the codes of particular questions. And that, when you had huge numbers, you used a card sorter to sort them out, and they popped into trays, rather like the Cope Chat cards with a knitting needle. And then, of course, we started programming using punch cards. I'll pass quickly on that because my Fortran programming wasn't fantastic. And after a time of data collection, of course, there's been the data explosion and the very real need for something like the JGI. So I'm delighted that it's here, based in Bristol, and I'm rather overwhelmed at the name it's got. So thank you, and I'm trying to live up to it, though I don't understand all of it. So that's my background in terms of technology. And of course, we then end up with a laptop where you can do so much. Who would have thought 50 years ago that that was going to be possible? So to start with, when I first thought of Children of the 90s, the acronym we invented was ALSPAC, which stood for the Avon Longitudinal Study of Pregnancy and Childhood. And my focus then was on pregnancies and childbirth in the first few years. I didn't look very much further for a couple of years, and then decided this name was quite wrong, and it changed without people really noticing much. Sort of bit of sleight of hand there. So that has been my life ever since. Now, 20 years ago, I had to retire because that was the rule in the university at that time. So at the age of 65, that was it. You were supposed to be done. But then there was a sort of Festschrift. And I gave a talk during which I tried to be very lighthearted, but asked the question as to whether this was the beginning of the end, and I should go on and travel around the world and do exciting things, or the end of the beginning. 20 years later, I can now tell you, it was the end of the beginning. And thanks to ALSPAC and all the staff and the team and the participants, in those 20 years, we've been able to show the disadvantages of maternal exposure to a common medication such as paracetamol, and the advantages to the developing child of the mother's diet during pregnancy, especially looking at the fish in the diet. But we've also done something I had never conceived of when starting the study. We've illustrated the importance of grandparental exposures in regard to the health and development of their grandchildren, and thus bringing in the idea of epigenetic effects. So we'd started by looking at grandparents, and there, of course, there are only 4 grandparents, which is more manageable than looking at great-grandparents, where each of us had 8 biological ones. And we find that each of them, in different ways, has a reaction that we can detect when looking at the outcome of the grandchild or the great-grandchild. Mind-boggling. And biologically, there are ways of explaining it, particularly when looking at experiments in animals. But that's got a long way to go. We're very excited by it. So then, of course, there's the question as to what should happen next. And I am only just starting to talk to the wonderful ALSPAC team about this. So we've got documented data already now on lifestyle features, or some of them, of 5 generations. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the first generation that we enrolled, and those were the parents themselves. We have an enormous amount of data on the parents, and it would be a pity not to treat them as cohorts in their own right. So we've already got 30 years worth of longitudinal data available, including on their lifestyle, on their mental health and their physical health. The parents are already committed to and enthusiastic about the study. They're proud of being part of it. Their mean ages are about 60 for the mothers and 65 for the fathers. And many of them still live in the Bristol area. I'm hoping that we might start examining those, or we have started examining them. I hope we'll be able to follow them up in the future. So far, we have plans involving people in this audience. So the idea is to look at cognition over time. And that's being led by Neil Golding. Vision, led by Kathy Williams. Hearing by Amanda Hall. And in general, the most important people in my scientific life in regard to ALSPAC are Kate Northstone and Yaz Alscaven. So thanks to all of them, hopefully the parents will continue to be a major part of the ALSPAC study. So I must thank a large number of people. I tried to put together slides which illustrated all of them and gave up. So it couldn't have happened without the support of my family, and my children are here. One of my brothers and his wife is here. So they've been wonderfully supportive, as has my other brother. My colleagues, I'm blown over to see some come from overseas, particularly from America, and all who've worked with me over the years, and of course, all the ALSPAC participants. And just as I was going to stop this study, this presentation, I thought I must mention Marcus Pembry, who was one of the many key collaborators at the beginning. And he was very clear about this statement. You have to study everything. You don't know what will turn out to be important. And I think that's a way in which we started ALSPAC. We always invited the participants to let us have their ideas. And so we have a huge amount of data, as everybody knows. So studying the life course has been the most exciting thing ever for me, and particularly for looking at the participants. And this is just a picture of one of the families, extended families, many of you whom are participating in ALSPAC. So thank you all for coming. I hope you will continue to be excited by ALSPAC. And hopefully there's some lunch available. But that's all I have to say, I think.
Wow. Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm all that stands between you and lunch. Sorry. So I think we've heard about lots of different projects and activities that have been inspired by what Jean's done. They've all been involving the connection between people and data, and really treating people as just more than just the data that you have about them, but as whole people, and having a conversation with them. It's really inspiring about how these things need to be managed.